directly to the front, eh? You can do the final.
You have to be aggressive. If you're not aggressive, you're not in the race.
Is it a little bit uncomfortable that you've got guys that people say, we don't really like the fact that you've got this ex-doper on your team and so on and so forth? Yes, that's extremely uncomfortable.
I'm very busy, but I always find a little bit of time for our listeners, for you.
With exclusive interviews and the best analysis on two wheels, this is the Telegraph Cycling Podcast.
Hello, my name is Richard Moore. I'm with Daniel Friebe.
Hello.
And making his first ever appearance on the Cycling Podcast, Mr. William Fotheringham.
Hi.
Now, what's that, Daniel? You got something to say?
Looking extraordinarily relaxed, isn't he? I'm not sure he understands the enormity of this undertaking.
Well, he's on a bit of a tour of the media hotspots in London today. He's done the Talk Sport. You're on your way to the BBC. William, you're flogging a book.
But this is the big one. I've done Talk Sport, the BBC to come, but this is the one that matters.
What are you doing at the BBC? Loose Women, is it?
No, it's Simon Mayo. I don't know.
Never heard of him. So this is the big one. You're flogging your new book, Bernard Hinault, The Rise and Fall of French Cycling.
You could call it Flogging the Badger, couldn't you?
You could. Oh, very good, very good. That's right, isn't it? The Rise and Fall of French Cycling.
The fall and rise of French cycling.
Bernard Hinault.
There's an interesting dynamic here today, isn't there? Because I'm the odd one out in the sense that I'm the only person here who's not written a book about Bernard Hinault, and Rich, you're the odd one out in the sense that you haven't written a biography of Eddie Merckx.
Wow, that was brilliant bit of plugging there. That was excellent. Okay, so we're missing Lionel this week. Where is Lionel?
Where is Napalm? Where did he get his nickname from? We promised to revisit that, haven't we? And we've not done it yet.
We will at some point. We have got racing to talk about. The Giro d'Italia is going on. It's fairly exciting. We'll get to that in a moment. First of all, in the absence of Lionel, I will give you a little bit of a weekly roundup. While the Giro d'Italia has been going on, there have been several other top races in France, Germany, the US and Hull. At the Tour de Picardy, Chris Bogmans won ahead of Andrea Guardini, while across in Germany, at the Bayern-Rundfahrt stage race, Britain's Alex Dowsett, the world hour record holder, built the foundations for his overall victory by winning the time trial stage. It was a good weekend for Dowsett, with Bradley Wiggins, who will attempt to claim his hour record next month, failing to beat his national 10-mile record in an event on the public roads around Hull. Peter Sagan answered his critics, foremost amongst them his team owner, Oleg Tinkoff, by winning the Tour of California with a brilliant, gutsy all-round performance, one that we will talk about later in this week's podcast. Meanwhile, a frenetic first week at the Giro d'Italia saw Tinkoff Saxo take early control, Alberto Contador fall off and suffer a minor shoulder dislocation, before Astana and Fabio Aru took the race by the scruff of the neck towards the end of week one. Richie Porte, meanwhile, of Team Sky, was biding his time and sitting in third at the end of week one. At least he was. Today's episode was recorded immediately after stage 10, at the end of which Porte suffered a puncture and was given a spare wheel by a rider on a rival team, Simon Clark of Orica Greenedge, to our fellow Australians and good friends. This looked initially like great sportsmanship, but the commissars thought differently and imposed a 2-minute penalty on both riders, a penalty that could be catastrophic for Porte's hopes of winning the Giro. No doubt we will return to this controversy in next week's podcast. In the meantime, here's this week's. Daniel, what were your thoughts on that?
We're not quite sure what the nature of the mechanical problem was yet, are we? But certainly Porte was really struggling to hold the wheels of, I think, 3 teammates had sort of set up a train in front of him, and he didn't manage to get back on and lost that time. It doesn't really bode particularly well for the next week, although this is, on paper, certainly in terms of terrain, this is the easiest week of the Giro, but I don't know. What were your feelings, Rich?
Well, it's funny because today we fancied being a bit of an off day. This week, in fact, is a much easier week on paper than week one. And I think a lot of people were wondering at the intensity of week one and whether that could be sustained and maintained over 3 weeks. So we fancied this week would be a bit of an easier week. Obviously, today was a very hard day for Richie Porte. And as you say, he didn't look that comfortable, did he? Just sitting on his teammates' wheels and trying to get back up to the bunch, which was chasing, but not chasing particularly hard at that moment.
No, and as you say, wondering what the effect would be of this very difficult first week, but also a lot of people have been wondering whether he would be the main benefactor of this turf war that's been going on, this sort of brutal war between Tinkoff and Astana that Astana certainly won in the first week. And it did look as though Port had an armchair ride, and Sky had an armchair ride in the first week, stayed very much in the shadows, and we sort of assumed that they'd been able to conserve more energy certainly than those two teams, but that didn't look to be the case today, did it?
No, and Mikel Landa of Astana, one of the revelations, I guess, of the first week of the Tour, leapfrogged Port overall, so he now sits third overall. Port's still in a reasonable position, but that could be quite valuable time. William, you've been watching a lot of the Giro?
Yeah, I've watched pretty much every day. In fact, I think the thing about today that's quite interesting is that you don't have to be that far off the back of the bunch to lose time, bearing in mind that they're taking the time on the front rider of what is a very, very strung-out bunch. So Port may not actually have been that far behind the bunch. What's interesting is that he just didn't look super comfortable in a situation where you would expect him normally to be better than his teammates.
Yeah, that was a surprising thing, I think, the fact that he didn't look that comfortable. And you get the sense there's been a lot of coverage around his motorhome, which we spoke about accommodation doping last week, didn't we? Team Sky have rolled out a motorhome for Richie Porte at this Giro. This might be a pilot for future accommodation doping. We don't know, but much has been made, especially over the rest day of Richie Porte's motorhome. We were given a guided tour on British Eurosport as well of the motorhome. You do have the sense of report that he needs everything to go right. Someone like Alberto Contador, for example, seems to be able to cope with as you said earlier on, Daniel, you could rip his arm off and somehow he'd still be there the next day. Contador seems to cope with adversity very well. Yeah,
and people tend to caveat these problems that Port, for instance, has had and said, well, we can't really consider last year's Tour de France because he got ill, but staying healthy, we've said on numerous occasions, that is part and parcel of what makes a Grand Tour rider. And you look, Armstrong is maybe a discussion apart because we all know how he won his Tours de France, but all of the great Grand Tour riders over the years have been incredibly resilient, and that's also why they can take on huge training loads in a lot of cases. And it is that ability to stay healthy. That is why they're Grand Tour riders and not great one-day riders in a lot of cases, because Grand Tour riding is an exercise in resilience, really, physical resilience and mental resilience, and that has been the big question mark about Port. We might all be proven wrong over this. He might have a fantastic second and particularly third week and come through to win, but that is the concern, isn't it, with Port?
Definitely. I mean, I think it was, as we mentioned earlier, an unusually brutal, savage first week where, hard stages, often short stages, but explosive, aggressive stages. And very early on in the race, we saw the three strongest riders in the race, didn't we? Port, Aru and Contador. And immediately, day three, you think there's the podium. Now, Mikel Landa has come into the equation a little bit now, another Astana rider. But those three have asserted themselves as strongest in the race.
I was going to say, I think that's possibly one of the hardest opening weeks that I've ever seen in a Grand Tour. Certainly I can remember. Just the way they've literally set about each other day after day.
That's the thing, though, isn't it? It's the riders that have made it the hardest rather than the course.
Yeah, I mean, it's very rare that, I think it was probably day two that you were looking at it and thinking, crikey, if, it's 80k to go to the end of the first station. If Tinkoff keep riding like this, they're going to be completely in pieces by about day 10. It's very rare that you see a team doing what Tinkoff were trying to do, and obviously Astana have then responded. And that is the thing about the Giro. The terrain is always propitious for this sort of stuff, but there's just no easy days. I mean, I think the Greipel day was probably the only truly straightforward day.
I mean, there was some interesting tweeting, always interesting tweeting from our friend Chris Baldwin, the Team Astana press officer. Now, most of Chris's tweets are indecipherable and too cryptic to have any meaning whatsoever, but he did say that first week, he hinted that Astana had basically targeted sort of 3 days in that first week to make the racing very, very hard, knowing that the second week was almost like a normal first week. And so this second week could allow the riders a little bit of rest and recuperation. It didn't allow Richie Porte that today, obviously. But, the thinking, they might have turned the race on its head a little bit by racing very aggressively, deliberately very aggressively, those few days, knowing that there was an opportunity to recharge a little bit in this second week. Do you buy that at all?
Well, this is something that's it's mirroring the trend among the Grand Tour organisers themselves. We spoke to last year in the podcast Javier Guillen, the Vuelta boss, and he drew our attention to the fact that Grand Tour organisers increasingly are making the first week very, very spectacular, and the second week does tend to be a bit of a lull, a bit of an interlude, and I suppose that makes it more difficult in terms of preparation for the riders and training, because we always used to hear that guys were going into Grand Tours a little bit overcooked and trying, particularly in the Giro where the third week traditionally is very brutal, and they were going to build their form throughout the race, but
you mean undercooked,
sorry,
you said overcooked,
sorry, undercooked. So it probably does create a dilemma, both in terms of strategy and training and physical condition.
I remember the opposite of that in 2012, that Tim Kerrison, who was coaching Bradley Wiggins, was worried that in that first week Wiggins would lose some condition because it was too easy. Do you remember that?
Yep.
That was a real... Listen, we've got a lot...
We mentioned tweeting. We should probably also mention... the performance of Astana and Aru in particular. There have been murmurs for weeks now, even before Greg Henderson's now infamous, notorious tweet, over which Aru has now taken legal action. I spoke to his manager, Alex Carrera, yesterday, who confirmed they've taken legal action in Turin. They've filed a case. Just to remind the listeners, Rich, we got Henderson's tweet, we haven't, but
I don't think we'd be allowed to read it out, but he basically hinted that Aru's reported illness, dysentery, was a cover for having problems with his biological passport, and that's why he was missing races.
Yes, and he invited him to come back to the peloton when he was not only recovered but also clean, and that was the sort of incriminating sentence. I mean, I asked Alex yesterday because the hypothesis that we came up with, or the best guess that we came up with, was that information is circulating, rumours are circulating based on someone who shouldn't have seen, or who wouldn't normally have seen Aru's biological passport, having in actual fact seen it. And one of our theories was that Aru had perhaps being interested in moving teams at a certain point and made his passport data available to a third party, another team, and they had been indiscreet and drawn certain conclusions, and this information had suddenly got into the public domain, or the sort of onto the peloton grapevine. Now, Alex Carrera, Aru's manager, yesterday assured me that no one has ever seen his biological passport except Astana medical staff, Aru himself, and the UCI. Do we believe that? I'm not sure, because I think Aru has spoken to other teams in the past. He's spoken to other teams who usually do request passport data as part of their protocol. So that could still be, I think, a source of these rumours. I
mean, certainly Aru has looked extremely good in the first week, having not shown much all year. And there was the illness before the Giro, which forced him out of a couple of races. And I think his... taking the race to Contador in the way he has obviously raised some people's eyebrows. I asked Chris Baldwin about his illness, and I think you've got a theory as well on dysentery and whether the English translation of dysentery is dysentery as we understand it. He said it is dysentery with a small d, more like violent diarrhea. He said he was ill, and he was quite anxious about being ill, and he got more ill. So I suspect that the illness is perhaps not as bad as us calling it dysentery suggested. But, as you say, Daniel, eyebrows have been raised about the collective performance from Astana. They've been extremely strong. And for a team that's been mired in controversy this year, clearly people are putting two and two together and going, aha. If, as Chris Baldwin suggested, they have targeted these sort of 2 or 3 stages in week 1, and we don't see much of them in week 2, that maybe puts a slightly different slant on things. I mean, as for the individual performances, I think Aru's performance is surprising, but he clearly is a rider who's been building towards a Giro. It's his main focus of the year. He's a strong rider. Mikel Landa's been somebody who's been emerging for the last couple of years. I think he was ill I think he had glandular fever over the winter, but he's obviously recovered very well. Dario Cataldo has been riding extremely well as well. He moved from Team Sky over the year. These are all strong riders, but as you've pointed out a couple of times, they're also missing a lot of, their A-team riders, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. And Tira Longo is another one. He obviously won the stage on Sunday. He's riding incredibly well. Time will tell, won't it? And in Aru's specific case, Aru's in his third year now as a professional, and we know how the biological passport works. It is based on usually several years of data. Most of the cases that have been brought have been based on several years of data. So we just have to wait and see. But it seems probably unfair at this stage to cast aspersions purely based on performances, as we've said before. And Astana are a very rich team. They've got a huge budget. They're climbing domestiques are guys who are earning 5, 6, 7, 800,000 euros a year. And if you fill a team with riders of that pedigree, then you expect the kind of performances that they have turned in this week.
Yes, I'm not a big fan of performance-based suspicion when it's purely based on performance, or the simplistic sort of assumption that X performance equals. William's sitting here brooding, looking very badger-like as we discuss this. What are your thoughts, William?
My thoughts are pretty much. I'm pretty much with you on Astana. It is a nightmare trying to, base anything on performance. And I don't think we should do. I think we have, but equally with Astana, you have to look at the background. Say this is a team that's on probation. But on the other hand, as you say, they are a very, very strong team, and they've clearly targeted the first week of the Giro. So they've presumably, to that end, they've all turned up flying. It may be a simple case that they've done their homework better than anybody else.
As I understand it as well, with the scrutiny that there has been this year, Astana are investing quite heavily in anti-doping and in extra measures. The UCI have also released their reasoned decision into the decision not to strip them of their licence, their World Tour licence, and the audit conducted by the University of Lausanne, which was damning in its first draft, if you like, that's continuing. So they're going to carry on being scrutinised by the University of Lausanne's researchers, and that will carry on over the whole year.
Another thing that's perhaps worth mentioning, William, you talked about the collective strength of Astana. There is an increasing trend towards teams training in big blocks of riders. We've talked about the Teide volcano in Tenerife on numerous occasions. Aru's been at Cestia in Italy as well, with several of his teammates. So, it may be that, and we contrast that with maybe what Tinkoff, Saxo, how they've been riding and not been going so well. So, it may be that their training as a block, as a group, it hasn't worked quite as well as Astana's training. And, perhaps they have trained incredibly hard for the first week and have all turned up, just right on the sort of crest of that form curve, as you say, William.
Let's leave it there and come back in a moment and talk about Tour of California and Peter Sagan, and then we'll talk about Bernard Hinault and William's new book.
British Eurosport, the home of cycling.
Okay, coming up on British Eurosport, the home of cycling, the Giro d'Italia, obviously ongoing with a friend of the podcast, Rob Hatch, and Sean Kelly has replaced Matt Stevens. Sean Kelly back after his knee surgery, and Giro d'Italia continues live on British Eurosport. Also coming up on 23rd and 24th of May is the World Ports Classics, which sees the latest comeback by Marcel Kittel. I think he's down to ride there, so another comeback from Marcel Kittel's. Time surely running out for the Tour de France, but we'll see how he does there. He was supposed to ride the Tour of California, which we're going to talk about now, won by Peter Sagan. Now, we all watched that on British Eurosport, I'm sure. I think
Was it fantastic? Was it? It's not often you see a bunch sprint in the end of a big stage race, and you see what happens there, where it was won by a tyre. That was great fun. It was just great entertainment.
Well, the context it was also that our very good friend Ciro Scognamiglio, and we'll hopefully have the Giro d'Italia coming up a little bit later on. Ciro did an interview with Oleg Tinkoff, which appeared in Gazzetta dello Sport, where Tinkoff basically said he would like to cut Sagan's pay for underperformance. We had said this in last week's podcast. We alluded to this. Daniel, you certainly had this information. Disgraceful, really, and unfair in the sense that Sagan has hardly not been performing at a high level. He's not perhaps won the monument that he would fancy winning, but he's been performing at a very high level. And, I suppose we can criticise Tinkoff's management, but also, look, well, in the case of Sagan, has it worked? I mean, or was it just his desire to, Sagan, big rider, he didn't lose, he hung on up Mount Baldy, stage won by Julien Alaphilippe, the young Frenchman, who took the leader's jersey. Sagan had won the time trial. So it was a great all-round performance by Sagan. And, I suppose the question is, did Tinkoff's management actually work?
Well, it's a good question, but one thing I would say is that Sagan is certainly not the only rider at Tinkoff who's had this kind of warning from Oleg Tinkoff. I'm led to believe there's a whole group of riders there who have been told in no uncertain terms that they need to up their game or else they will face the same kind of consequences that Tinkoff is talking about with regard to Sagan. But we really need to tell the real story of why Sagan won that race and why a teammate of Julien Alaphilippe was actually the reason for Sagan winning the race, don't we?
Go on then, Daniel. Go on.
Well, I've got to say, this is something a guy in a pub told me this story. I'm not sure whether it's true. But on the second stage to a place called Lodi, not to be confused with Lodi in Italy, we saw Mark Cavendish and Peter Sagan having a long conversation in the bunch midway through the stage. I understand that one of the subjects they talked about was why Cavendish was wearing specialised aero helmet that day and Sagan was not. He was wearing their more traditional helmet. Cavendish explained to Sagan that these were marginal gains. It was important on flat stages where there was probably going to be a sprint. It could be the difference between winning and losing. Anyway, what happened? An hour or so later, Cavendish beat Sagan by a matter of millimetres. That was stage 2. Forward wind to the end of the week. Julien Alaphilippe had got the leader's jersey, hadn't he, on Mount Baldy. Sagan was in a position where he had to finish third in the final sprint to dethrone Alaphilippe. We got to the final sprint. Cavendish in his aero helmet won easily from Walter Whipper at the final stage in Pasadena. And behind him, who should win by, he should get third place by similar margin to the second stage in Lodi by a couple of centimetres, if that, Sagan over Tyler Farrar. And what was Sagan wearing? He was wearing an aero helmet.
It's amazing what you can find out in a pub, isn't it? I mean, so a guy in a pub told you all that, and that won him the race overall.
Yeah.
What a bitter irony.
That conversation with Mark Cavendish.
Wow. Well, there you go.
I'm absolutely flabbergasted. I mean, I find it very hard to believe that somebody as highly paid as Peter Sagan could not be using an aero helmet, given that every third cat in Britain is riding them currently. I mean, he clearly hasn't spent enough time observing what's going on in the British amateur peloton, because, especially, aero helmets of every kind of de rigueur, basically. So.
He's not very aerodynamic anyway, Peter Sagan. I mean, there's a lot he could do to be more aerodynamic.
In all seriousness, that probably was the difference between him winning the Tour of California and not winning.
I'd absolutely say that. That would make the difference. That would be enough. Just those millimetres. I would be flabbergasted, except that I know that the World Tour peloton, they don't always do things as obviously as we think they do. Down here we all think, they're World Tour, therefore they are doing everything they should do. But actually, there are still gaps that some of them don't look for.
Does Alaphilippe know about the conversation that Cavendish had with Sagan regarding aero helmets?
I would suggest not.
Oops, I hope he's not listening to this podcast. Otherwise, Tour of California, I remember a few years ago Bob Stapleton talking up this race, saying this was the future, that that riders who were going to the Giro instead of the Tour of California were making a huge mistake. I remember him saying, Contador, I think it was at the time, isn't paying attention because he was going to the Giro instead of Tour of California. But it seems to be a race that has lost some of its luster from those years. I'm talking about 2008, 2009, 2010, where it seemed to really be on the up. And Sagan's win aside, and the great story that gave us, it wasn't, and not forgetting Mark Cavendish's wins there as well. It was a disappointing field, was it not overall?
Yeah, well, there was a lot of talk about Sagan's performance on Mount Baldy. I think he finished 7th on the uphill summit finish there, and Alaphilippe won that stage, and there was a lot of surprise about how Sagan had climbed that day. But really, when you look at the guys that he was riding against, the only climber with real World Tour pedigree was Sergio Hinault, who was looked to be on an off week. So it was a slightly disappointing field, and the same really goes for the sprints. I mean, Walter Whipper rode extremely well for Drapac all week, but he was probably consistently the guy who came closest to Cavendish. Cavendish pretty much had it all his own way, didn't he, in the sprints? And as you say, Rich, it has lost, I would say, not just a little of its lustre, but a lot of its lustre. And, I think AEG, the organisers there, are seriously considering making changes, maybe another date change. The first few editions of the Tour of California to take place in February. They moved it to May to go head-to-head with the Giro, and it hasn't worked, has it?
No, although we should say that friend of the podcast, Theo Geoghegan-Hart, rode extremely well. And I think finished 14th overall then, but he was 15th up Mount Baldy. You think he was 13th, was he, Daniel? I mean, that's an outstanding performance by him, and he's consistently doing very strong rides in big races, and he seems to raise his game when he steps up to that senior, and even running its World Tour teams, as he did at the Tour of Britain last year as well. William?
Yeah, you'd have to say that Geoghegan-Hart someone has to give him a World Tour contract at the end of the season. If he wants it. Assuming he wants it. Do you think he might not want it?
I think he might take he's taken gap years before. He might take another year as an under-23, I think. It's possible. No? I mean, Teo's 20 now, is he? Maybe one more year, Will? No?
If you're good enough, you're old enough.
Oh. Well, the Yates brothers were 20, weren't they?
That would be my exemplar, would be the Yates brothers. He's maybe not in that sort of the same class in that they seem to have that ability as under-23s, when they were so young, to just win. They seem to have that winning ability, which is quite rare, whereas Geoghegan-Hart seems to be more of a sort of consistent bike rider, but he's certainly got it.
William, what do you make of Oleg Tinkoff? I mean, he's great copy, as we'd say, and he's hugely entertaining to those of us who are not employed by him. But the way that he conducts himself, the things he says, it's outrageous. It's controversial, entertaining, whatever, but it's not really on, is it?
No, I think there's two sides to it. Yes, it is great soap opera, but equally it's this kind of soap opera actually that you don't want in a serious sport. To me, you want the sport to look as if things are being done properly, and to me, calling out your second biggest rider and saying I want to cut his money, that's not the kind of that just seems like a peculiar management technique to me. And I just think the problem with loose cannons is that they behave in an unpredictable way and they can have unpredictable consequences. He's already saying that he's, as I read it, that he's not certain he's going to continue at the end of the year anyway. It just strikes me that there's a lack of stability there, which is not good for the sport. Whereas what the sport actually needs now is it needs big, serious sponsors. Sponsors from outside cycling who want to invest in it for proper commercial reasons. Those are the sponsors it needs to be getting. Rather than guys who maybe I wouldn't fault his enthusiasm for cycling, but I just think that there's what the sport needs in terms of stability is actually more skies, more giant Alpecins, more of those, even more Borers. It needs big commercial companies to come in and put some Europe cars. It needs those big commercial names to come in and be run, and have their teams run very professionally by people who are professional managers. And
for all that his criticism of Sagan seemed to get a positive response from Sagan, that climate of fear that seems to exist at Tinkoff Saxa, where riders are terrified of not performing and of Tinkoff himself, is not a healthy environment. And when we talk about pressures to cheat, to dope and stuff, you imagine that those conditions can be created in that sort of atmosphere.
particularly in the case of the Tinkoff-Saxo riders who have that sort of Damocles of the team disappearing at the end of the year over their head. You know, a lot of these guys will move on to other teams or would move on to other teams, but a large proportion would be in serious trouble if Tinkoff was to pull the plug at the end of the year. So, they're faced with his ultimatum to either start performing better, win races, or oblivion as far as professional bike riding is concerned. And I think the climate in that team at the moment is a very difficult one. There've been a lot of changes with as far as the coaching is concerned. Bobby Julich came in, very very highly thought of at BMC and Sky, but there've already been riders who have had to change coaches in the last couple of months because it wasn't working with Julich or someone else. And I think it's a very difficult place to be at the moment, that team.
This is the Telegraph Cycling Podcast. Join us on Twitter and Facebook. Just search online for the Cycling Podcast.
In a moment, we will hear from Ciro Scognamiglio of Gazzetta dello Sport with his Giro d'Italia. But first, a quick reminder that you can become a friend of the podcast for £5. Please go to www.thecyclingpodcast.com. Our next special for friends of the podcast will be released very soon, and there will be a couple of others before and indeed at the Tour de France. Details at thecyclingpodcast.com. And now, the Giro d'Italia.
Hello listeners, it's Ciro here. I'm in Forlì. The Giro d'Italia has been really exciting till now, but the best is yet to come, because in this second weekend of the race they will do the time trial from Treviso to Valdobbiadene, 60 Ks, and then a climb finish in Madonna di Campiglio. So it's for sure that the best of this Giro is yet to come, but mainly listeners, it's only less than 1 month to my next holiday. This is the most important thing for me, and you already know. Thanks.
Where are we, Lionel? Lionel, where are we? Where are we, Lionel?
Stay cool this summer with your exclusive Cycling Podcast t-shirt. Each t-shirt features a classic Cycling Podcast moment, a terrible joke, or pay homage to some of the friends of the podcast, including Christian Prudhomme,
beautiful landscapes, passion for cycling, passion for a tour, French flags, British flags, yellow flags, bunting.
Roger de Vlaming.
Where did Sean Kelly come in the 2005 wife carrying world championship?
He didn't, but he does own donkeys.
And Giro.
No, I'm not in Great Britain, I must confess. Yes, but no, I must confess, no.
The t-shirts are available in a range of colors for just £19. Get your Cycling Podcast t-shirt at thecyclingpodcast.com.
Okay, I'll go for Brian Cockar.
I suppose to rather the finish, he's a very I hesitate to use the word spunky, but hey Lionel, back in your kennel.
Bunting. Right, William, your moment has come. Your book, Bernardino, The Fall and Rise, The Rise and Fall.
The Fall and Rise of French Cycling.
The Fall and Rise of French Cycling. Bernardino, The Fall and Rise of French Cycling. Published by Yellow Jersey. I think it's available in all good bookshops.
Yep, out this week.
You've sort of been around some of the big names in the canon, Fausto Coppi, Eddie Merckx. Obviously, you wrote the definitive Eddie Merckx biography. One of them.
There were two published at the same time, I'd say.
There were two published on the same day, I believe. And and obviously your first book was Tom Simpson, Put Me Back on My Bike. But Hinault, tell us about your approach to the Hinault story, because he is. Daniel's a bit younger, but for me, I got into cycling in the 1980s, and Hinault was perhaps the guy who got me most interested in the sport. He was such a formidable athlete, a sportsman who seemed to be like cycling's Muhammad Ali, or somebody with that aura about him, which he still has to some extent. But tell us about why Hinault and what your approach to the story was.
Well, I was kind of inspired by a very obscure book about Hinault called Slaying the Badger, which I don't think many people have heard of. So now,
you will have done now.
Yeah, so that's a good plug there for Richard's book. But no, to start with, it's a question of looking for for gaps in the market, things that haven't been done, and it was clear that a biography of Hinault was needed. That was my view, and I wanted to do one, and I also felt that that you get different things out of all these. So the Tommy Simpson book was kind of linked to my father to some extent, because that was kind of where I started, because he was my father's hero. The Fausto book was linked partly to me living in Italy, experiencing cycling in Italy and so on. And Eddie, I had to write it because Daniel was writing one.
So you're in first name terms with him. For Daniel, it's always Mr. Mert.
Okay, so, but I mean, the Badger book a lot of it ended up being quite nostalgic as well, because like you, I got into cycling at that time. It was also linked to the fact that I went and raced in France and saw the 1984 tour and the 1985 tour pretty much, on French soil, which was quite a remarkable thing at that time, because obviously we didn't have that much access back here, because Channel 4 didn't come until 1986, as I remember it. So there was a bit of a sort of, it kind of turned into a sort of an 80s nostalgia fest in some ways.
And you interviewed Hinault himself, obviously, and a few of the principal characters, peripheral figures and so on in his story. We know Hinault as this ferocious competitor. He still has that aura about him. We've seen Stage Invaders and so on at the Tour de France where he's performing his podium duties, and he would. But is there another side to Hinault? I mean, what? Tell us about Hinault off the bike. How is he now? Is he mellowed?
No, I don't think he has actually. I was quite amused by two lovely stories I got. One from Stephen Roach about how they went off to ride this randonnée together, this sportive together, and they were sitting in the first or second, probably the second row of riders in the sportive, chugging along, and some guy starts wobbling about, and Hinault apparently growled at him, "Watch what you're doing," and the guy. And a few miles later, he did the same thing. Watch what you're doing. And the guy says, "I've never ridden in a peloton before." And he said, "Be careful, it could be a last time." And this is a sporty. And you say, I don't think he's changed that much, because the other one was Russell Downing told me a lovely story how they rode up Crag Vale in Yorkshire, sort of March last year. But it was part of publicising the Tour de Yorkshire, the Tour de France started in Yorkshire. And they rode back down again, and Hinault was basically trying to drop him on the descent and managed it. So I don't think he's changed at all. I mean, I think I think what I learned most of all with Hinault is that what you see is what you get. I really don't think there's any division between Hinault, the guy that we've all perceived over the years as being this colossal hard nut, this quite aggressive character, this quite sort of almost overtly aggressive. I don't think there's much difference, And I think what I do feel I got out of the book, or got out of talking to him, which perhaps I hadn't got out before, is that actually what that disguises is there's a big appetite for life there. He's quite Epicurean in some ways. He'll talk about the pleasure of winning a bike race. It's all about the fun of racing, the fun. And, obviously the point is that bike racing is flipping good fun. If you are the strongest guy and you're giving everyone else a right kicking, it's blinking good fun. Gosh, seriously, that is. You think of those great,
How do you know?
Well, okay, the normal human beings amongst us get that once or twice in their lives when you're really, really good on your bike and you're able to do what you want. You've probably had a lot more times than me, Richard, given your background. But
not this century.
So you know what I mean. So there's a lot of enjoyment there. But there was things like when we were driving along in through Yorkshire. He was talking about how you'd shoot you've seen pheasants in the fields, and it's like, well, right, I could shoot that, kill that, and pluck it and cook it, and right, what wine would I have? And so there's an intense discussion with him and his driver about which whether it be a Burgundy or a Beaujolais, and so I think that side of him was quite a surprise. He's not as dour as he's made out to be. He's got quite a good sense of humour, but I think by and large, what you see is what you get.
What I mean, my book finished in '86 with that battle of his with Le Mans, and he retired that same year. Famously, he'd set the date for his retirement years before he stuck to it. He was still in his, it was his 32nd birthday, so he rode his last tour age just 31. And I guess the confusing thing about is where did the aggression go? Where did he find an outlet for that competitive spirit that he clearly had? Because he didn't even ride a bike for years and years, did he? He only returned to riding when he retired as a farmer. Where did that go? Where did that aggression go?
Well, that's quite interesting, and I'm not actually sure, to be honest. Maybe he didn't have that outlet. I mean, he certainly went into various business ventures. I remember when I went to see him in 1993, I think it was. He was involved in a sort of thing supplying bakery supplies. But what struck me was that I don't know where that aggression was. I know he retained the joy of competition. I know that because he was talking to me about how selling a bike in his son's bike shop in Saint Malo is actually like winning a bike race. He's just a satisfaction with a job well done, basically. But as for the urge to dominate, I don't know where that went. I mean, I think you still see it a bit because when you talk to him, you feel he's trying to get on top of you. You do an interview with Bernardino, and you're left. I've done several, and you're left feeling that this guy is number one, and it's kind of like it's like talking to Top Dog. You're left under no illusion, but he's not actually unpleasant about it. That's the interesting thing. I've never felt he's an unpleasant guy. I've just felt that you're left under no illusions about who's the boss.
And yet, there's almost a curious lack of ego, isn't there? Because he was somebody who seemed to just be able to switch off, move on, and not be forever defined as Bernardino, the great bike rider.
I think the point was that he never viewed bike racing with a great deal of romance. It was something he did and he liked and he was good at. And I think it was Alain Vigneron who said that suddenly it was like, oh my God, they're paying me. And he couldn't believe how much they were paying him just to ride his bike. He also didn't really behave in a sort of like a starlet. He did some funny things as when he was in his early phases. In his early phase as a pro, he'd do things like turning up at Tour of Flanders and just I think he did actually put his racing shoes on, but basically walk across the square, pretend to take the start and then go home again. It was very strange. Some of the stuff he did, he didn't, and obviously, being a father, obviously that shook him up as well. So he's not as quite as simple as he looks. I mean, I like Cyril Guimard's theory that actually the aggression disguises quite a lot of vulnerability, but I've never really seen the vulnerability, I have to say.
No, he seems, Daniel and I have commented on this before, because Daniel and I went to see him together when I was working on my book, and he is somebody who's very comfortable in his own skin, not prone to self-doubt, which made him so interesting as a contrast to Greg LeMond, who's racked with doubt. And Hinault is not somebody who seems to...
I think the thing in 1986, a lot of that actually boiled down to the fact that as personalities they were so polarised. I think because Greg is so insecure and so racked with doubt, when he came up against Hinault, and Hinault was just this sort of complete utter certainty, doesn't give a monkeys. I don't think he actually particularly gave a monkeys whether he won that tour or not. I think that was what Greg simply couldn't deal with. And I think a lot of the ill feeling that went on was simply it was just a clash between two different visions of cycling and two completely different personalities.
I mean, I think in terms of the sort of greats in the history of professional cycling, the guy who he most reminds me of, and this was certainly reinforced by your book, William, was Lance Armstrong in an awful lot of ways. How linear he is. Also the curiosity, the intellectual curiosity that you mentioned, the fact that he would lie awake at night reading Reader's Digest and, science magazines, and he had this great appetite for learning and knowledge and curiosity and filtering out information that he wanted to apply to his own riding. I mean, when I was helping you with your book, Rich, we spoke to Cyril Guimard, I'll never forget, asking about Guimard about Hinault's sleeping patterns, and Guimard said, well, let's say the Badger didn't really sleep, he kept watch. And so you had this image of...
You have to be reminded of Lance, sort of, because Lance probably kept watch as well. Lance didn't let much escape him. I think you'd have to say that there probably were similarities. The need to, I think if we look back at Merckx, for example, obviously, Daniel, you know this better than I do, that, with Merckx, there was this, same as Greg, colossal insecurity, physical and mental, and I think the ultimate sign of Hinault's security, if you like, his confidence is the fact that, as we said, he was able to set a date and walk away from the sport. Absolutely astonishing. How many guys dare to do it. The only other guy I can think of who's actually doing that is Bradley Wiggins.
Lance Armstrong tried to do it, let's not forget.
He couldn't do it. That's the point. He couldn't stay away. Lance had that need. Arguably Lance's life now might be considerably different if he had stayed away.
Well, the difference, I guess, is that in retirement, Armstrong still needed an outlet for that competitive drive, that aggression, which Hinault seemed to just put in a box and close down. But
I think the point about Hinault was that he could put things in a box. Exactly. I think he did actually, because part of the point about Hinault is that he was famously, again, where he's different from Merckx is that Merckx, it was like he had to win everything, whereas Hinault, everybody says the point about Hinault was that he would target. He would say, he would turn up at the start of the season X kilos overweight. He would grumble for a few weeks, and then the race he'd target, he'd win it.
But the question of the comparison with Armstrong is a very interesting one, because the thing that Armstrong is probably most reviled for is not the doping but the bullying, and this is something that Hinault did himself. He was the patron, which effectively was bullying. I mean, I've got a story in my book Étape about Joe Pellier and his first tour. Yeah,
Pellier wasn't the only one by a long shot.
No, I mean, you got in trouble from you got chased down and you got
and you got it for the rest of the tour. That was, I think the thing about Pellier is that Pellier, it wasn't merely that Pellier was chased down on that one stage. It was that Hinault clearly continued doing it through the rest of the tour in order to put his, in order to make the point. But the interesting thing about that, of course, is that Hinault did precisely this when he was a young rider himself. There's half a chapter dedicated to it in my book, which is basically that he would turn up at these crits and someone would say, right, this is the order of play, Bernard, it's, Jacques Esclasson is going to take all the preems. And Bernard would say, I'm not having that, bang, and he'd just take, and he would deliberately set out to wind up his elders and betters. So he was actually trying to stop the young riders from doing the stuff that he did himself.
Again, very reminiscent of Armstrong.
Yeah. I mean, and it's short. Sean Yates is pretty critical of him. Robert Miller's pretty critical of him. I was quite surprised by how critical the Anglos were of Hinault in some ways. Quite surprised.
And yet, not many of those guys rode with him as teammates. And I found doing Sling the Badger that ex-teammates of his, from Andy Hamps and Steve Bauer, for all that things went a little bit sour at the Tour in '86. As a teammate, they were raving about him. They were very, very warm towards him. They said as a teammate, he was generous and he was somebody who would really take... I mean, Andy Hampson, he helped him win the Tour of Switzerland that year and really gave him an armchair ride. And he was incredibly he had incredibly warm memories about that.
Yeah, I mean, I remember translating Laurent Fignon's book. I mean, this is what actually strikes me most was when I translated Fignon's autobiography, the way that Fignon just eulogised him was quite astonishing. Particularly given that Fignon's career took a far less pleasant trajectory than Hinault's did. Also, given that they obviously had that ding-dong battle in 1984.
The last couple of chapters deal with the legacy, I guess, of Hinault.
Part of the reason why I had to do this book now was that it had been in my mind for some time, but we hit the 30th anniversary this year of the last French winner of the Tour de France. That's a big, significant anniversary. That's a huge expanse of time without a Frenchman winning the Tour. So part of the point of the book was to look into why the French haven't managed to succeed Hinault, and there is a whole panoply of reasons.
And in 5 words, why?
Pressure, and pressure.
Okay, thanks, William. Well, thanks very much for joining us this week. You've been a more than adequate replacement substitute for Lionel.
Thank you for having me.
I hope you'll come on again when you're not just trying to flog a book.
I'll come on again anytime. It's been a great pleasure.
Great. Well, thank you, William, and thank you, Daniel.
That was quite a good game. The 5 words to explain why. Frenchmen.
I managed 4. I only managed 4, I'm afraid.
What'll be your 5th one?
Oh,
I'd say something like foie gras, bière, dopage, and Armstrong.
Okay, well, let's wrap up there. We'll be back next week with Lionel again. I think you're back to the Giro, Daniel, but we'll hopefully see you at some point next week. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll be back talking about the 3rd week of the Giro next week.
You've You've been listening to the Telegraph Cycling Podcast. Thank you to Glass Pear for the music in this episode. For more information and to download more editions of the show, visit thecyclingpodcast.com.